Good morning. We're here with Chief Judge Phyllis Hamilton at the Ninth Circuit Courthouse in San Francisco. My name is Claudia Sanchez Wilson. I'm an Associate General Counsel at Zynga Inc. here in San Francisco, and I'm privileged to have been a former law clerk to Chief Judge Hamilton, and I'm honored to be here with the Chief Judge today. Good morning, Judge Hamilton.
And good morning, Claudia. And as always, I'm glad to be here with you as well.
So I'd love to just start by learning a little bit about your early life experiences, and can you just start by telling us where you were born and tell us a little bit about your family?
I was born in a little town in central Illinois, Jacksonville. It's about 30 miles east of Springfield, which is the state capital. Very small town, fewer than 20,000 people, one high school, one junior high school. So I grew up in a somewhat rural community surrounded by farms and factories back in those days. I was born in Jacksonville, but my mother took me and my two brothers to the West Coast, and we lived in Portland, Oregon. She died when I was 4 years old, and we were living in Portland. I have two brothers who are all 1 year apart, so she died with a 4, 5, and 6-year-old. At the time of her death, her brothers and sisters, my grandparents had 13 brothers and sisters, and they were, those that were living at the time were all spread out all over the country, and my brothers and I were all spread out and sent to live with different relatives. At a very young age, I ended up with an aunt in Vancouver, Washington. But in any way, my mother's oldest sister, Isabel, the oldest of 13 children, decided after a couple of years that she just would not allow all of her sister's 3 children to be raised separately. They should be raised together. So she decided that she would raise all 3 of us. And she contacted the brothers and sisters who had, the various different, my siblings. And she decided that she would take us and move back to Illinois. My grandparents' home was still standing. In fact, it still stands today, barely. And she decided to take us back there. At the time, she was married, and her husband thought that was a bad decision, that it would totally disrupt their life. He wasn't moving anywhere, and as a result, she made a choice. And the choice that she made when I was 8 years old is a choice that has completely impacted my life. I was an orphan, essentially. I never knew my father. And my Aunt Isabel left her husband, left a cushy life. She was living in Berkeley, California. Cushy by the standards she would soon find herself in. And she took the 3 of us to Jacksonville, Illinois. And we moved back into my grandparents' home, which was sort of on the outside of town. We were surrounded by farms. We had our own farm, small farm. Well, we had a field, let me put it that way. And so she took the 3 of us back there. She left her husband. And because when she was 14 years old, in the 9th grade, she had to drop out of high school because she had 12 brothers and sisters, and her parents, my grandparents, needed assistance raising the children. She had a 9th grade education, so leaving her husband and her comfortable home, taking her 3 sisters' children back to Illinois. She had so few options herself. She became a domestic. She worked cleaning other people's homes throughout my childhood, and we lived in, like I said, my grandparents' home, which was on the edge of the country. It was country enough that we had an outhouse and no running water. So I grew up in a house that had a well with a pump on the back door stoop, and we had to boil all the water that we used to wash our dishes, to wash ourselves, etc., on the stove, and we had to use an outhouse. Now, for an 8-year-old coming from the West Coast, it was a traumatic experience for me. But I had my brothers with me, and I had my aunt, and we moved into a home in which another of my aunts and her 2 children lived. So there were 2 sisters and 5 kids. That's how I grew up. And I have to say, notwithstanding the fact that we had limited means. My other aunt worked in a nursing home as a dietitian, cook, and like I said, my aunt worked as a domestic. But between the two of them, they brought the 5 children up very well, notwithstanding that we were poor. I lived in this town, though, in which everyone was poor, so it wasn't like it was so apparent to me that my life was that much different than anyone else's. There were a lot of people in the schools that I attended that had, the same kind of circumstances, that lived in the same kind of circumstances. But I have to say that those were the formative years for me. I worked in the fields when I was 8, 9, 10, 11 years old until I was a teenager and able to get a job, in a restaurant as a car hop at Bob's Big Boy. It was my first outside job. I've worked my entire life since I was a child. And those years, I think, really made me the person that I am today. The woman who raised me, my Aunt Isabel, for her entire life, she never missed a day of work.
Wow.
Ever.
That's amazing.
Her entire life. She went from working as a domestic to working in the laundry at the state hospital, the largest employer in our hometown. And I have to say, I've been on the district court for the Northern District of California for 27 years, and I have not called in sick one single day that I have worked at the court.
That's amazing.
And I think a lot of it just comes from the way in which I was raised. I was raised to work hard. We never accepted, my aunt was way too proud to ever accept any public assistance. She raised her niece and 2 nephews on her own, essentially. So I think I get my very, very strong work ethic from her.
And she sounds amazing, and that does sound like an incredibly formative experience. Do you think, it sounds like you were obviously incredibly resilient. Do you think that some of that strong work ethic and resilience was that formed by having her as your role model?
I think so. I think she was the single most important factor. She's what saved me from a life that, who knows what would have happened had she not taken us all together. And she was so incredibly strong, and it was important for her to make sure that me, more than my brothers, I have to say, the most important lesson she wanted me to learn was that of self-reliance. And to this day, I think I'm one of the most self-reliant people that I know. I do things for myself. I don't expect things from others, and I'm always grateful when that happens, when I do get things from others, because none of us is an island. I mean, I didn't get to where I was, to where I am now, on my own. I mean, I've had all along the way, but she was definitely the most important role model for me and the most significant influence in my life.
And how did that influence your decision to become a lawyer? Did you know that from early on, or was that a realization that came later?
No, it came later. It came later. Like I said, I grew up in a small town, one high school, and at the time, the public school teachers were the most respected professionals in the town in which I lived. This was not a community in which there were a lot of professionals to model oneself after. I never knew a lawyer or a doctor. In fact, I never went to a doctor the entire time that I was growing up. The first doctor I ever went to was when I was a college student and went to the student infirmary. So I didn't have those kind of role models, but I had public school teachers. And the town that I grew up in, literally, the teachers knew everyone. The public school teachers taught the generation of my family before me and the generation after. And some of them I still have relationships with. When I go back to my hometown, there are a couple of them that I still look up. Of course, they're much older now, and most have passed on. But I think that the second most important influence in my young life were the public school teachers in the town in which I grew up. Back in the old days, they used to track students, and they put you in the college track or not. Very few people in my hometown went to college. In fact, the majority of high school graduates in Jacksonville, Illinois, in the 1960s when I graduated in 1970, but the majority of high school graduates went to work in one of the many factories on a farm in the surrounding communities, or they went into the military. Both of my brothers joined the Army and didn't have the same opportunities I had. The school teachers, though, from the 8th grade, from the very first class that I took, recognized something in me. I don't know what it was, but I was tracked with all the smart kids. I was always in this section. There was one section in grade school and in middle school and in high school with the college track kids. I didn't realize then that's what it was, but I was in that section. The only African American child, obviously, in a community where there were few African Americans anyway. But the school teachers sort of plucked me out of my life and put me on this track, and to this day I have them to thank.
That is really incredible. So how did you decide where you wanted to go to college?
Well, in the late 60s, there was the beginning of the Black Power movement. It was part of the political upheaval of the times. And all the African American students said, you know, we need to be full-on participants in the experience. And they put me forward as an applicant to be a foreign exchange student. No black student had ever been a foreign exchange student with the American Field Service. 2 kids from our school were selected each year, one for the summer semester and one for the school year. And I put myself forward and I said, okay, I'm ready to go. And I was selected to go. I was a very good student. I was an honor student. And I was selected to go, and I wanted to go to Paris or Brazil, and instead they sent me to Zurich.
Kind of close to Paris.
Close to Paris. But I had a wonderful experience. I lived in the Swiss-German section with a Swiss-German family, whom I'm still in contact with. And I went there in 1969. I was there when Man Walked on the Moon, I recall that. But in any event, I met a young woman from Bakersfield who was going to Belgium, and she in fact spent her semester in Belgium, and we became good friends. And during our senior year in high school, she convinced me to apply to Stanford. And no one in my school had ever, except for the football coach, had ever even heard of Stanford. No, seriously, the counselors, because they were counseling students mainly to go to state schools in Illinois, they just simply didn't have any particular knowledge, you know, about private schools on either coast. But in any event, just following my friend Emma, I applied to Stanford and got accepted and got, you know, financial aid, which is the only way I was able to go. That took me out of Illinois. But I tell you, it was the summer I spent as a foreign exchange student that was really instrumental, not only in opening up the world to me, and I've since become a world traveler, but also opened up my eyes to there being so much more than what was represented in the small town in which I lived. So I thank my friend and we both ended up at Stanford together.
Wow. And what was that transition to the West Coast like? And your just sort of being not for the first time, but you know, for a large extended period, having to study and grow into adulthood in a place that was outside of where you had grown up in that close confines of your aunt and your family. How was that experience for you, and how did it sort of form maybe your later decisions in career?
It was a difficult transition for me. I was surrounded by, and it wasn't a totally positive experience for me either. I was surrounded by all these kids who came from money and who had experiences that I'd never had. I remember the first time I ate an artichoke, and everyone thought it was so weird that I didn't know how to eat an artichoke. I'd never seen an artichoke before. I remember being ridiculed because I was always at the dining hall on time for dinner. I thought it was great that they were just providing us with this food and we didn't have to do anything. We just showed up and they would give it to us. It was definitely a difficult transition, but ultimately it obviously served me very well in life.
And you went straight from Stanford to Santa Clara for law school?
I did. I finished Stanford in 3 years. I was a communications major. I was able to finish all of my requirements early, and I just decided that I wanted to go forward in my life. And so I went to law school early. And it's not, I have different memories about what it was that prompted me to want to go to law school. I do remember in high school sitting on the gym floor with a bunch of girls who were all plotting their futures, and all I knew was I was going to be a professional of some sort. No one in my family had ever gone to college, no one had ever gotten a professional degree, and I knew that I was going to do that. And law was something that I kind of knew a little about because I've been reading political books. I knew it was a way in which to help affect social change. You know, I watched TV, and I had some exposure to that as a profession. And I think it sort of stuck with me just from those early years when I declared I am going to be a professional of some sort or another. When I got to college, I sort of toyed with the idea of being a veterinarian because I love animals, but I have no abilities in math. I took whatever the basic math courses I was required to take, and I knew I didn't have a chance.
And how did you, once you graduated from Santa Clara, I'd love to know just about your early career decisions and where they took you and what your first jobs were and how you experienced being a young attorney, you know, out there doing it and being the professional you had dreamed of being.
Well, when I was in law school, I did an externship at the Superior Court, Santa Clara County Superior Court. And I recall working with another extern for a judge on criminal law and motion calendar, and the fact pattern was a violation of the California not notice provisions, in which a man and a woman were both arrested in a motel room. I think it was a drug-related offense, but the woman was naked during the police detention. And I remember trying to convince the judge, me and another female extern, tried to convince the judge that no way did the police give notice because no woman laying in bed naked would not have tried to cover herself before the police broke in the door. And he was having none of that. And I remember thinking to myself, well, if I ever get to be a judge, I'm going to be more practical than that. It seemed like the obvious answer to me as a student, but I do think that my externships, I had 2 of them, and one was with a wonderful man who's still a judge on the appellate court in San Jose, Eugene Primo, and he was just a fabulous mentor to me.
That's wonderful. And when you picked, I think your very first job was working for the Public Defender's Office, and as I understand it, it was a new office at the time. What was it about that first job doing advocacy and public defense work that really attracted you?
Well, I because of the experiences I had as an extern, and because I got great grades in crimes and criminal procedure, I was drawn to criminal law. And I was fortunate enough to get a job at this new state public defender's office. It was the very first year that it opened. They were taking only 2 new graduates. All of the other attorneys were seasoned attorneys. What attracted me to the work was that I would be in an office with all of these really, really great lawyers, and I would learn from the best. And that is, in fact, what happened. The majority of lawyers had long careers as trial attorneys in Alameda and San Francisco, Alameda County and San Francisco, and they trained us, and we provided advocacy mainly on the appellate level and for our clients who were already in prison. So I enjoyed that, but it didn't take long. I mean, within 5 years I realized I'm not a defender. This is not a lifelong vocation for me, and so I started looking elsewhere.
And how did you decide what your next role was going to be? And why don't you talk a little bit about what that role was?
You know, most of my career has been fairly serendipitous. I've been at the right place at the right time. I've been open to new experiences. And I just found out about a position as an administrative judge with a federal agency called the Merit Systems Protection Board. I was sort of interested in employment and labor issues, and I thought, well, that could be interesting. I went in, I'd only had 5 years experience. I didn't really think I'd be selected for this position, but I got the position, they say, largely on the strength of the writing experience I got at the State Public Defender's Office. But here I was, 5 years experience under my belt, and here I am, this hearing officer for federal employees. And it just took the very first hearing. The very first hearing on I think it was a disability benefits sort of complaint of a retired federal employee. And I was sitting at the table with lawyers on both sides, and they were arguing the points, and there's something happened. I immediately thought, this is where I should be. Not on that side, but here in the middle. There was something that was very attractive to me, to not be part of the dispute, but to help resolve the dispute, to be able to decide the dispute. Now, there was a transition. I had to learn how to be an advocate, how to write as an advocate. You understand this, and how to write as a neutral, as opposed to having
very different.
Written as an advocate. It's a very different mindset. And so there was a transition period, but I loved that job. And I probably would have spent my whole career in that position, but for the fact that there were President Reagan era rifts. I think that he reduced the federal workforce by like 20%, and at the time in the mid-'80s, all of the women in the office lost their jobs.
Oh, wow.
All of the women, because all of the men had veterans preference. Almost all of them were veterans. So it was odd. It was a little odd. So we got our notices that we were going to be riffed. But before the riff actually occurred, I secured another position. And once again, it was totally serendipitous. I had been a volunteer pro tem judge in Alameda County, and I would do night court for small claims court. And they were looking to hire their first commissioner to handle small claims court, traffic court, misdemeanor court. And because all the clerks knew me and really liked me, they supported my application, and I was hired before my riff in the first job. And I felt extremely lucky, because once again I was in a neutral position. It wasn't that I had this goal necessarily to be a judge, but I liked being in the position of a neutral, and so this just dovetailed very nicely for me.
And just curious, but what is it about being a neutral, do you think, that suits you so well? Is there something, do you think, in your personality, or just by training, or basic demeanor that really calls to you about being a neutral and that suits you for it?
I think it's a combination of the role I've always played in my family and just my personality. I think it's a combination of both. I'm the youngest of 3 kids. I have 2 older brothers, but I was always sort of the bossy one, and I was always the one that was more analytical and making the decisions for us as a group when the 3 of us needed to get together. And I think I just sort of gravitated naturally to being a sort of a decision maker as opposed to an advocate. I think I'm better at it. Of course, the only advocacy job that I held in my career was as a public defender, but I do think I'm a better judge than I was an advocate.
And were there any early challenges as a young lawyer, because you were pretty young taking on some of these neutral roles, were there any particular challenges that you recall sort of coming up against and maybe needing to overcome?
Not that I can really think of. The Alameda Court was mainly a challenge to my ability to manage people.
Mhm.
It was more of a public relations kind of job as far as I could see. The commissioners, well, we all know that state court is where all of the world's problems end up, right?
Yeah.
Because there aren't solutions, and so people are, they find themselves in the civil or criminal justice system. And the commissioners are sort of the first face that people see, and you represent the cop that gave you the ticket, the fines that you're going to have to pay, and all that. So it became, I think, a real challenge to my ability to deal with 300 people in the course of a morning. I mean, my calendars would be hundreds of people. So while I do think I learned more people skills and learning a degree of patience, learning how to manage cases and people and move things quickly while still giving the appearance of justice and fairness, I think I learned that there, although it wasn't an intellectually challenging job, which sort of turned me away from it.
And as you went through these different, roles and sort of career choices that eventually, and we're going to get to that in a second, brought you to being a judge, were there any particular mentors or specific influences and people that helped steer you through your early career?
Yeah, I've actually been very fortunate to have had really strong women role models in almost every position that I've had, and particularly in the Oakland court, there were two judges, one who I'm still very close to, Judy Ford. She was the chief judge of that court during a period of time when I was the commissioner. She was a really good role model, and in fact, I had met her for the first time when I was in law school, when she came to speak at the invitation of the Feminist Law Students Association. Can you believe in the 70s there was something called the Feminist Law Students Association? And she was the director of the regional director of the Federal Trade Commission at the time. I was so impressed by her, and I couldn't believe my good fortune when 10 years later I find myself in a position where she's interviewing me for a job, and she hired me, she recommended me, she supported me, and she was a mentor to me and a real supporter of women for all the years that I was in Alameda County.
And how important did you feel that mentorship, particularly within your own career, was to influence you as you were, deciding, for example, what's the next right step for me?
Well, what I really learned from her, I think, is the value of mentorship to people. She helped me. I feel like I was successful. I felt she had a stake in my success. That's how much she cared about whether or not I was able to do the job, whether or not I had the support and resources I needed to do it. And that became important to me as I advanced in my career and was in a position to provide that kind of support and care to younger people coming behind me. It's all about the people on whose shoulders we stand and our responsibility to pull up ones coming behind us. And it's particularly important to me for attorneys and women of color who don't have the same kind of opportunities. I really do think that that's what success is built on. It's opportunity. There's so many people who, but for some particular opportunity they're given, wouldn't have wouldn't be able to do much with their lives. But because the doors were opened for me, I have to prove myself once I get there, right? But having someone to help open the doors for you is a lot of people. That's all they need. Is just help me get my foot in the front door. Judy Ford was that for me in my early years, and I've tried to be that for other people coming behind me.
Yeah. Well, as a recipient, I can definitely attest to that. I'd love to talk a little bit about how you actually transitioned to your judgeship, essentially, and how did that opportunity arise for you, your opportunity to join the Northern District?
Once again, totally serendipitous. A lawyer was talking to me during the period of time that I was at Oakland Community Court, I contacted Claudia, who was a magistrate judge at the time. And she gave me a lot of the background information, and I decided that it sounded really interesting and I would apply. Because of the work that I had done, and I had a good reputation now in the county, even though none of the judges of the district court who make the decision to hire magistrate judges, none of them knew me, but I interviewed well, they checked my references, I had great support in Alameda County, and they decided to take a chance on me, and they hired me as a magistrate judge. And I thought, wow, that's pretty amazing. Because I had not been a federal practitioner. I worked for a federal agency, but that was it. But I did have some judicial skills. So that's what prompted me to make the move from state court into federal court, and that's where I've been since.
Wow. And what was your first experience like in federal court and in federal practice? Was that a tough transition to make from, more state side?
I have to say it's very, very different experience.
Yeah.
There's far more decorum and order and process. All the things I love. All the things I love. It brought out the best of me. I think being a federal magistrate judge, particularly in the Northern District of California, was really one of the best jobs that I ever had.
Wow. And you were at that job for several years before you made the move to Article 3 and were appointed by President Clinton. Because that does not necessarily happen to every magistrate judge, how did that happen? How did that door open for you?
Well, I actually was sort of prompted to apply. Someone on one of the vetting committees called me, said, I appeared before you, I've worked with you on settling cases. Have you given any thought to throwing in your hat in the ring for Article 3 judgeship? I thought, well, no, I don't know that I have the background and credentials for that kind of thing. No, you want to give it some consideration. So I thought about it, and I applied. And it was funny, during the interview that I had with the vetting committee, there was a lawyer on the committee who was from Chicago, and he said, how does a girl from Jacksonville, Illinois, how do you feel finding yourself here being interviewed for a position that might be a lifetime appointment by a president of the United States? And I thought, I feel blessed and honored that I've even made it this far. So I was interviewed. I was recommended as a finalist to Senator Feinstein. I was interviewed by Senator Feinstein along with a number of other very prominent lawyers. I didn't think I had a shot at it. It took almost a year before I got a call, but I got a call. I got a call from her chief of staff one day, and he said, I know it's been a long time, but I'm just calling to find out, are you still interested in this position? At the time, I had just met the man of my dreams. I was on the verge of getting married. My life was changing. I wasn't quite as interested in having a new job as I had been before, but I was really curious as to whether or not they'd even consider picking me. Why else would they call me unless they were really considering? So of course I said yes. And then she called me the next day and said she was going to recommend me to the president.
Wow.
Which was, it's just not an experience that I would ever have thought to have had in my lifetime. To be recommended by a senator.
That's amazing.
It was pretty amazing.
And did you have any hesitancy at all about, going forward with the process as you were deciding, or was it just, a natural extension of everything you've done before?
No, I did have some hesitancy. I have to say, I loved being a magistrate judge. I loved it. And the workload in our district at the time was just daunting. The district judges worked so much harder than we did. And their caseloads were so huge. Yes, I did have some hesitancy, but I'm glad that I did it. And I was able to work out from underneath the workload. And I'm the last judge on our court in which which received a caseload built on all the discards from other judges. We stopped doing that
Right.
because it's so inhumane for a new judge to start with 400 or 500 cases that nobody else wanted, right? We don't do that anymore.
Yeah.
We give new judges only new cases. But anyway, I was the last judge, and it did take me about 5 years to sort of dig my way out of that. But once I did, I realized that this is actually the best job in the world.
So that transition between Magistrate Judge and Article 3 Judge, was it as, it's not shocking, but was it as much of a change as you had anticipated?
Yes, and more so. I don't think there's any way to describe or any way to appreciate the unrelenting flow of paper that a district judge deals with. Even to this day, even though our caseloads have shrunk a bit, it's unrelenting. And in order to adjust to that, you have to adjust your way of thinking, your approach to the work. You can't be the kind of person that I have always been that wants to check off my to-do list and be done and be able to go, okay, I'm done. You can't do that. Because as soon as you check one off, another one comes in. So you have to be satisfied with the individual accomplishments.
And what were the changes that you had to make to do that?
I'm not sure that I actually have satisfactorily made that change. I mean, I still like to, feel that sense of satisfaction. But I think I've gotten accustomed to it, and it doesn't bother me anymore. I think I've called upon the advice I was given by a departing judge when I first took the position, and he said, Phyllis, you have your whole life to do this job.
Wow. And your career is so remarkable, I think, for, one, I think your background and, what you experienced growing up and how it has been a formative one that has changed your outlook, I think, and your, the resilience and the grit you've shown, and also because I think many Article 3 judges don't have as much time in their career being a neutral as you had before you eventually became an Article 3 judge. And I'm just curious, are there things in your background you think that uniquely suit you, and your career as well, but that uniquely suit you to be a good judge? That, by the time you took the bench as an Article 3 judge, you'd been developing for many, many years, and maybe help you develop qualities that you think are particularly good on the bench? Are there?
Well, I think the qualities that are good for a judge are sort of in the eye of the beholder. I mean, I think they're different for different people. For me, it's important to show patience and understanding, to not be quick with the sanctions, to try to set the tone through your own conduct and the way you treat people. I have a much softer touch, I think, than others, although a good command of the courtroom is important. And the values that I think are most important is to make sure that people are fully heard and to resolve things as expeditiously as possible. I mean, I'm not the kind of person that sits on things for a long time. I think litigation, in order for it to be effective and to comply with Rule 1's directive, I think that decisions have to be made, and they have to be made quickly, not quickly, but expeditiously.
And how about some of the more memorable cases that have come before you? Do you have, one or two that stick out as particularly career-defining for you as a judge?
Yeah, a couple. I think that in 2002, I was appointed in 2000, and in 2002, I received an assignment. I had a request to preside over my first MDL, a multi-district litigation. I'd only been a district judge for 2 years, and this involved antitrust law, about which I knew nothing, which of course you know. And it took a couple of years for the case to build up, but from about 2004 until about 2012, that really was the most significant case and the most resource intensive case that I worked on. It was about 60 some odd class actions that were consolidated before me, and it involved every issue of antitrust law, as you know, that can potentially arise. And I have to say that what I enjoyed most about that, including our 5 years together, you as the clerk with total responsibility for that case, including the stints during which I had to hire another law clerk to handle your other work because you were working exclusively on that. But I have to say that I look back at that as being one of the biggest challenges as a district judge for me, but one of the biggest joys. It brought me intellectual satisfaction because the issues were so meaty and because it required us to go places where courts hadn't gone before.
Right.
I felt like we were contributing to the development of the law. It's simply unfortunate, though, that for every really critical order that we issued on that case, that the lawyers would always take it up on appeal and dismiss the appeal the day before the oral argument, right?
Yeah.
So there's still no answers to a lot of these questions. Here we are 12 years later. So I would say that the DRAM, antitrust MDL, was important for me. And it was important for me for another couple of reasons. Because I had no background in it. Of course, you coming to work for me from McCutcheon, where you had some background in antitrust, was a monumental help, and it was so satisfying to me. And I don't know if I've ever told you this, Claudia, but for you and I to walk out into that courtroom and to see 40, for the most part, white male antitrust lawyers. There's still not enough women and people of color practicing in that area, in my view. But to command their attention and their respect and to handle that case the way we did was a very proud time for me. Very, very proud.
Yeah, I felt the same thing. Just from my own, when I would walk in and I would see all of that, I just remember the sea of suits that you would see in the courtroom, and I would feel very proud just watching you up on the take the bench.
Yeah.
So I definitely felt it too.
So the business cases, because I don't have a business background, were a source of pride for me, being able to handle them. My big Oracle versus SAP trial, which you recused on because your best friend was one of the lawyers. But having that trial with those lawyers working at such a high level, I'd never tried a case other than a patent case in which the lawyer was so good and the attention to detail was just so incredibly high. And I enjoyed that. It was so much work, but I really enjoyed it, and I particularly enjoyed being affirmed, even after having busted the verdict. I mean, the $1.3 billion verdict, which I overturned, I think it's the only time in my entire career that I ever overturned a verdict, but it was clearly the right thing to do, and I can say that even though the Ninth Circuit affirmed me. So the business cases, I think, provided me some of my proudest moments, just because I had no background in it. But I also had one criminal trial that was particularly memorable for me, involving a Vietnamese national who was living in France at the time, but she came to the United States to protest the communist government, and her intent was to self-immolate in the Marriott Hotel in downtown San Francisco. And she was apprehended with a bucket of gasoline and lighters, and she was apprehended, and there was no damage, but she was charged with terrorism and arson and attempted arson and other things. And it was the trial was attended by the entirety of the Vietnamese community in San Francisco. And I remember the Marshal Service was very concerned about security, and they were taking everyone's big lighters, and they were concerned about there being a fire or something like that. But the courtroom was packed, standing room only, and there was never a sound made by any of these, for the most part, older Vietnamese immigrants watching this trial, and I recall one of the big issues was whether or not this woman should be allowed to tell her story about her escape from communist Vietnam and about the atrocities that were perpetrated on her family and her people. And the government really resisted that. And I really thought, you know, it's likely she's going to be convicted of at least the attempted arson. You know, she's probably, and if she is, that was a mandatory 5-year prison sentence. All she's ever wanted was to be heard, and I overruled all of those objections, and I let her tell her story. And she came into court with full garb from her ancestral village, and she told this very eloquent story, and she spent several hours. The jury was rapt. It did not in any way persuade them or dissuade them from doing their duty, and they returned a verdict of guilt on at least the attempted arson. But she felt really satisfied with having been given that opportunity to speak before this audience of her people. And to this day, she still sends me Christmas cards. She's out of prison. She's back in France. She still sends me cards.
That
to
is
this
amazing.
day, thanking me for allowing her to have her day in court, even though I had to sentence her to prison for 5 years.
Wow, that's really amazing.
So that's one of my memorable cases.
And so, what, in terms of being a judge, what is the biggest challenge that you feel like you deal with?
Oh, just the workload.
Yeah.
That's just the workload.
Okay. And that workload recently has, I hope, changed a little bit, because now you're, of course, the chief judge, and you've taken that role on for the last few years. And I would love to know a little bit about that transition from Article 3 to being a chief judge, and how that opportunity arose for you and how you decided to take it.
In the federal system, one is not elected to or appointed to the chief judge role on the trial court level. It happens by operation of statute. I'm the most senior judge who has not yet turned 65. That's how I ended up having the position available to me. Of course, I didn't have to take it, and I had a little hesitancy. I wasn't really sure I was going to be as interested in the administrative responsibility or the sort of public responsibility, being the face of the court, and I wasn't sure about the support of my colleagues. Having been with the court for a couple of dozen years already, I knew that there were some chiefs who were more supported than others by our colleagues, and we're a very collegial bench, and I'm very lucky in that regard. But I was a little concerned about that, and I talked to Thelton Henderson, who had been a chief, who I knew also was reluctant to take it when it was his turn, and after talking with him, I pretty much decided that he had been the first African American chief judge, and there were certain aspects of it that he liked and certain that he didn't. But he impressed upon me the importance of people in our position being out there, being the public face of the court, just because of our responsibilities to our communities, our opportunities to be role models for young lawyers coming behind us, and for women lawyers. And so I sort of reluctantly agreed to do it. But within a week, I realized it was absolutely the right thing for me to do, and I love being chief judge, and I love the administrative responsibilities and being the public face of the court as well. And I think what I've learned in the few years that I have been chief judge is that I have an entirely different way of doing things than other people. And my reception by the lawyers has been just tremendous. They tell me they've never had as much access as they have with me. Lawyers email me directly. We don't stand on ceremony. They don't have to go through my secretary in order to reach me. Just send me an email if something's going on. I make myself available to them, the lawyer representatives who work for us, who do so much work for the court, the Federal Bar Association that does work for the court. I make myself readily available to them. I like having an informal relationship with all of them. And I realized that someone like me, my personality is different. I'm not a terribly formal person. I think there's some benefits to have different kinds of leadership. But in addition to the public face of the court, there's a lot of administrative responsibility. There's no one on my court that's as detail-oriented as I am, that likes to get into the weeds as much as I do about the policy, the process, the procedures. And I have to say that the support that I get from the judges of my court is tremendous. It's tremendous. It really makes being chief worthwhile. They appreciate that I'm going to get into the details. They don't worry about it. They call, they drop a problem on me, and they know I'm going to take care of it. And I like that. And this has sort of allowed me to tap into a different skill set, my management skills. I think I'm a really good manager and administrator. And it's sort of a good way for me to wind down my career by doing something other than the cases. I have a reduced caseload, and so I'm spending a lot more of my time on administrative responsibilities. And I think a lot of people don't like that, but I do, and I think my court's really lucky to have someone who really likes it. And I feel a great deal of appreciation from the judges of my court and from the staff of my court, because I am bringing a different approach.
That's great. And I know we're running short on time, so I have two more questions for you. One is, as you sit in the chief judge spot and you look back on your career, and as you say, you begin to think about winding down your career, how does it feel when you take stock of where you are now and you look back on where you started and you remark on, everything that came in between? How do you feel?
I feel incredibly lucky. I feel incredibly blessed to have had this opportunity. I don't know what I did in my former life. Well, let me use this analogy. I sometimes think that by having met and married the man that I met and married, that the higher powers were telling me, you've been a good girl. Because I never would have thought that I deserved the kind of marriage that I had. I kind of feel that way about my career, and particularly my career at the Northern District of California. I don't know what I did in my life to deserve such good fortune, and I will be forever grateful that the judges appointed me as a magistrate judge and that President Clinton appointed me as a district judge, because aside from my marriage, this is the most fulfilling part of my life.
Wow. And then slightly related, but on a different note, if you imagine there to be other, small children just starting out, perhaps not in the most likely of circumstances that will lead them to a position like yours, is there any advice that you would give them, having lived the life that you've lived and had the career you've had, as, I don't know, words of wisdom or a parting, remark that you would leave?
I think I would simply say, strive to be the best person you can be, because the qualities that you admire in your mother, for me, my aunt, those are the qualities that I think are going to take you the farthest in life. I would say guard your reputation. It's the only thing over which you have any control. And once it's gone, it's gone. I've been very lucky to advance because my reputation has been good. And I would say, I guess that's it.
Yeah.
Just strive to be the best person you can be.
Wonderful. Well, thank you.
Well, thank you.
It's been very nice to hear all of your experiences, and it's really been a wonderful lesson in many ways, and really wonderful to have you share it. So thank you.
Well, thank you, Claudia.